this country was more peaceful and was developing faster in the first 6 years of our independence. Why was it so? Because we had a genuine federal constitution.
Nigeria must have a truly people's federal constitution made by its ethnic nationalities and interest groups. The 1999 federal constitution restrains, I repeat, restrains development and harmonious coexistence of the Nigerian peoples.
The crisis that we are facing today in the world is one of security, yes, for sure, but crisis of governance and crisis of leadership.
I would like very briefly to touch on good governance in our country. And here I would say that I align myself very much with what our chairman said in his opening speech about restructuring the Nigerian governance system. Because at my age, I am now 92. Privilege of living through Nigeria's history. And my regret is that Nigeria is essentially still a country and has not become a nation. We are still struggling to become a nation. Because some of the challenges we face now, I believe can be better managed if we were a nation of citizens who would be imbued with national patriotism, who would want to work for their nation. We have not become a nation. Nigeria is still a pluralistic country. And as I have said on a number of occasions, pluralistic countries are all over the world. Those of them that have succeeded in surviving and remaining individual political entities have been those who addressed their pluralism through genuine federal constitutions. And those pluralistic countries that failed to address their pluralism through genuine federal constitutions have disintegrated. If I may give you just a few examples. India, Canada, these are pluralistic countries. India has survived for about 5,000 years or more. Canada, whose pluralism was seriously challenged in 1968, has survived because it addressed its pluralism through a genuine federal constitution. But those pluralistic countries that failed to so address their pluralism have disintegrated. If you think of Yugoslavia, that existed for almost 100 years, it disintegrated into 7 independent states. If you think of Czechoslovakia, that existed as one country for they are separated into two states, the Czechs and the Slovaks. And then you think of those coming here and from here in Africa. Think of Sudan. Sudan existed as one country for over a century, for over 3 centuries. But Sudan disintegrated into Sudan and South Sudan. So I have been quite consistent in advocating for a new democratic constitution for Nigeria which addresses our pluralism. Because the constitution we have at the moment, the 1999 constitution, as amended, does not address our pluralism. This country was more peaceful and was developing faster in the first 6 years of our independence. Why was it so? Because we had a genuine federal constitution which allowed the 4 regions to take care of their internal development, their social facilities, their education, health, and their internal security. But since the military stepped in January 1966, we have become what I would describe as a unitarist government country. And there lies our biggest challenge. Because the constitution we have at the moment puts the center at the apex of the nation, and the federating units which in the days of Samadu Bello in Kaduna, Michael Okara here in Enugu, and Obafemi Awolowo in Ibadan, and Dennis Osadebe in Asaba. The country was developing through healthy competition between regions. The security, internal security, was assured. I remember it in 1955, a colleague of mine, Junior Law, and myself, who were undergraduates at the University College of Ibadan, we traveled by road from Ibadan to Maiduguri using trucks. There were no buses then. We were passengers in trucks, in lorries, they were coming. Without any bother about insecurity. In 1962, my wife and I drove from Ibadan. We left Ibadan at 7:30 p.m. coming to the east. We got to Akure just before midnight, spent the night, and then the next morning we went to Asaba and crossed the Niger by the ferry. The ferry was what carried the cars and people across because the bridge had not been built. Without any bother at all about insecurity. But now, can you do that? I'm afraid I would advise you not to attempt it, because you might be kidnapped on the way, or armed robbers might get at you, and the so-called bandits, I basically use the word so-called bandits, would get you. So, ladies and gentlemen, I would say that good governance is possible and should be possible, but only if the fundamental the drawn norm, that is the Constitution, allows and encourages good governance.
That have been selected as the current theme for the annual lecture series, namely on the imperative of good governance in Nigeria, which have taken the liberty to amend to include a global comparative perspective, couldn't be more fitting and timely. It is timely because around the world, amid what scholars have described as a situation of chronic crisis, that is the intersection of multiple crises all taking place at the same time. We are living witnesses to unprecedented governance and leadership challenges that seem to precede the end of an epoch in world affairs. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the crisis of governance and leadership playing out around the world has been a source of intense and multiple discussions, from gatherings of international political and business leaders, meetings of diplomats, scholars, and civil society leaders. The crisis has been one topic that has, for various reasons, commanded attention both nationally, regionally, and globally. Now, I decided that I would add a global perspective because sometimes we in Nigeria, we think we're the world. We're not. We're special, but we're not the world. And even our status in the world is related to our relations with our immediate neighbors. Then the West African sub-region, then the African continent, and the world. But it's interesting that concentric circle of interest and policy perspective and action is now being kind of thrown on its head. And many times, what is happening in the world affects what's happening in our continent, Africa, affects what's happening in West Africa, and affects us. In any case, as three of us in this audience who are foreign ministers of Nigeria, we have to think nationally, regionally, continentally, and globally. And it's in that context that whereas Chief ANYAOKU was the first African to become World Secretary General of the UN, I had the privilege also working with two Secretary Generals of the United Nations who are also the first to be Secretary Generals of the United Nations. The first was Boutros Ghali from Egypt, the African continent. The second, from the so-called Sub-Saharan Africa, was Kofi Annan. And between them, they were both the most intellectual as well as the most diplomatically astute Secretary Generals the world or the organization has ever seen. And it's in their time and under their watch that they produced two seminal, in fact more than two, seminal reports. The first was by Boutros Ghali, An Agenda for Peace, in which he argued that there can be no development without peace. And therefore, the world should concentrate on how to prevent wars, failing to prevent war, to keep the peace and build the peace, and preventing diplomacy. But he also then followed that with another report, which is relevant to our discussion today, An Agenda for Development, in which he argued that there will be no durable peace without sustainable development. And it was Kofi Annan in his own agenda, which he called a larger freedom, which he argued there will be neither durable peace nor sustainable development without democracy, good governance, and the pursuit of human rights. So, peace, development, democracy, good governance are the nexus which applies globally. Now, for various reasons, the crisis that we are facing today in the world is one of security, yes, for sure, but crisis of governance and crisis of leadership. particularly even the so-called mature democracies, or what is often called the global north. There has been disagreements because many things are happening there that you will have thought this is not what we expect from the United Kingdom, United States, from France, from Germany, and all of them. Because they are not supposed, they are the ones that are the guardians of democracy, of good governance. They are the ones who dictate to us what governance should be about. But it's like when the United States is going to have election, maybe we should send observer missions from Nigeria and the global south. Because some of the things that have been happening recently, from open disagreement over election results, the violent contestation of polling outcomes, the collapse of electoral integrity, to the erosion of judicial independence, the chaotic eruptions in legislative houses and riotous street protests underwritten by alien, rated and irate youth. The world has been exposed to scene of political instability and decline that was once thought to be the exclusive preserve for the countries of the global south, and the typical characteristics of generalized underdevelopment. These developments have come against a backdrop of the decline in party politics, the fragmentation of political society, and deep social cleavages. The collapse of the post-1945 elite consensus even in the West, and intensified voter apathy as the state-society social contract constructed after Second World War slided into atrophy, a gregarious abuse of power and office by public servants and elected officials, the disproportionate influence of money, including criminal funds, in politics. Now, there are so many reasons that has been alluded for this. I won't go into details, but I want to mention that in the face of the crisis of governance and leadership that have become undeniable in the global south, scholars have competed among themselves to find the best characterization of what was unfolding. Some spoke about democratic regression, others prefer to talk about democratic decline, while others suggested that it was a case of backsliding or even a recession. Usually we talk about recession with regards to the economy, but then people have begun to talk about recession in democratic governance. Whatever characteristics they opted for, there's unanimity among them that the governance center is no longer holding in the way in which it was expected. Arguments are rife as to what has led to this crisis, especially soon after the celebration of the triumph of the liberal order and the end of history following the collapse of the then Soviet Union and the dissolution of its ideological bloc. Whatever the explanation, the roots of the crisis of governance beclouding the countries of the global north, two things are clear. The first is that the crisis has also dovetailed with a moment in world history when the post-1945 global order, established under Western hegemony generally, and the US dominance in particular, is giving way to a multipolar world in which the re-emergence of China, India, Russia are key players, along a suite of assertive middle powers like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, the United Arab Emirates, and so on. A new world order seemed to be in the making at a time when political systems are also in need of an urgent and radical remake. It is a season of unpredictability, a season of instability, a season of insecurity in many polities and the politics among nations. The second aspect of the crisis that stands out clearly is the fact that it has been refracted beyond the global north into the countries of the global south in varying degrees. So the disease is spreading, this time from the global north, so-called advanced democracy, into the global south. The implication is that the celebrated third wave of global democratization, which when it was propagated also gave the impression of the end of history, an exorable march towards the world, towards liberal democracy as the only viable and sustainable form of administering public affairs, that did not endure as much as was expected. It was a scholar, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book, The End of History, in which he claimed that with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the ideological bloc, then the Cold War is over, the West has won, and that's the end of history. And I recall at that time that even as a scholar from the global South, I said any talk of end of history is the beginning of nonsense. There cannot be an end of history as long as there are forces of change being challenged by the forces of status quo. The contestation between the haves and the have-nots, between the rich and the poor, between the privileged and the underprivileged, will continue to make history a continuum. Coming to Africa, that period of high expectation that democracy is come here to stay witnessed investment in institutional reforms that came under the broad rubric of good governance programs supported by the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the various bilateral donor agencies, with emphasis on the promotion of transparency, accountability, media freedom, judicial independence, rule of law, and so on. At the same time, a political conditionality was applied by donors through which governance reforms, including the abandonment of political monopoly and encouragement of electoral pluralism, were made prerequisites for continued development assistance. The combination of internal and external factors at play led to the return by most African countries to competitive politics. So that, as I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation, here in the 1999 in our own country, we feel that there's a rebirth of multi-party activities and a raft of constitutional reform processes that entail, among others, the widespread adoption of the limitation of term of office for elected officials, especially president. But we soon learn that those high expectations are not necessarily going to remain fulfilled unless we work hard. In our own country, we thought with the high expectation of the return to democracy in 1991, the thought of third terms of a president extending his term beyond the constitution will not be something that will even be entertained even for a short period. So the argument I'm making is that we thought the 1990s was a period of a second liberation. The first liberation was liberation from colonial rule and domination, that the second liberation from one-party states dictatorship was over. But now it seems like a kind of regression may be creeping. In our own region, West Africa, we have at least 3 military rulers in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Guinea may even be working in that direction. I was privileged to have been sent to Senegal by ECOWAS to go and have to lead a presidential election observation mission. And I took that job seriously because I reflected that imagine if Senegal has gone the way of Burkina Faso, of Mali, of Niger, there will have been a setback towards the kind of protocols that the African Union and the ECOWAS have put in place, that there will be no acceptance of change of government other than by constitutional means. Thank God the Senegalese people's will prevailed. And we have a young president elected who's younger than my first son. So I'm really actually an old man. I have to remind myself constantly when the president is much younger than your first son. But I make the point that if it had gone the other way, then there will be a clear division between the Francophone and the Anglophone. It will be set back to democracy, and it will be disappointment for the youth who have invested a lot in the coming to power of the current president of of Senegal. Nigeria is the third most populous country in the world. We are already the most populous in Africa, but in the world. Next, first to India, second China, and third Nigeria. I was in Singapore. I'd like to share with you when there was a debate in their parliament that their population is going to increase by 200,000 people. An uproar. How can we deal with this 200,000? Where would they live? What would they eat? Power, schools, hospitals. And yet, in less than 25 years, Nigeria will be the third most populous country in the world. So, governance is if you're going to be more critical. Where will the people live? Food security, human security, hospitals, schools, and all of that. And this is what should be preoccupying our leadership and our followership rather than who is decamping from one political party to another and for what reason. I had the honor of chairing at one point which committed itself to an agenda 2063 for Africa, at peace with itself, with gun silence, and move towards continental renaissance. Now, coming back home very quickly, it was like other countries in Africa. It was so obvious that while good governance was as best key to the alternation of power that took place through the ballot box, it didn't necessarily contribute to the diversification of the socio-economic policy direction in most African countries, including our own. In fact, what emerged is that regardless of party, regardless of leader, regardless of government voted into power, no matter the campaign promises that were made, policy remains essentially the same, derived from the same unchanging orthodox prescription of the international financial institution that continue to dominate the framework and the context of fiscal, monetary, and social measures based on their neoliberal vision of the world. The consequence was power alternation failed to deliver substantive policy shifts and simply came across as an elite game of musical chairs in which, in French, pour chercher, pour se lamenter. The more things change, the more they seem to remain the same. Not surprisingly, the voting situation became increasingly apathetic and cynical about governance under elected politicians. The rule should be precisely that good governance is happening at every level and in every state of the federation. However, few will doubt that much more has been expected by Nigerians for the experience of elected government today. Quite apart from the structural problems of poverty, inequality, and unemployment that are, as earlier noted, common to all African countries and are present in abundance in Nigeria, there are such challenges as multifaceted insecurity at the center of which are various long-running insurgency, a breakdown of trust in political leaders and institutions, and absence of a least consensus even on some of the most basic issues of national development. I know that Ikebajiko, our chairman today, and I have been talking and wondering where have we gone wrong. And as I sent to him a report, guess what? The Hausa community in Nigeria petitioned the International Criminal Court asking that they intervene in Nigeria because of discrimination. Everybody seems to be aggrieved. So there is the proliferation of aggrieved peoples. So what do we need? A leader with a vision and that can unite all of us so that we turn being aggrieved into being committed to the Nigerian project and to restore a social contract between the rulers and the ruled. In the face of the crisis of governance that the country has been grappling with, it is regrettable to note that there has been a positive of visionary and Pan-African leadership at all levels to offer credible options for a rebound. We have been talking at the beginning of this presentation, this event, almost the good old days of the 1960s, when EMEKA, Ibadan, Kaduna were the federative units at the centers of governance, the federative But more importantly, look at the quality of the leadership then, when the challenges were fewer and less complicated. Now the challenges are not only national, more complex, and yet the quality of it doesn't always match the gravity of the challenges facing us. Compared with the kind of leaders we had, even in the time when Enugu was the capital of the Eastern region, Ahmadu Bello, the head of the government center in Kaduna, and Sisomoson Awolowo. And they were people, should be reminded, they were the ones supporting the center. They managed their affairs and resources and contributed money to run the federal government. Now we have the reverse, whereby all the state governments go to Abuja for their monthly allocation. That people forget, that was in our lifetime. And there was healthy competition, rivalry. Who can govern the best? Who has the best initiative? Who has the best visions? The first television station, universities, development corporations. Where have all the leaders gone? So, at the time when the dissatisfaction, there is the bulk of the population are confronted with disrupting the town their living standards. Excellencies, more seriously to the point, the challenges that are concluded, that have clouded and overwhelmed our achievements in 1999 will point to the urgent necessity for us as a people to take a step back and rethink our system of governance in order to achieve a much-needed national reset. In doing so, several action points have become imperative if we are to enjoy the full benefits of good governance over a sustained period of time. Some of these imperatives are being actively debated in the country already. These imperatives serve as a key takeaways, which I would only love to leave with you. But among the proposals is a call for a new constitution entirely, advocated by the patriots, headed by our own Chief EMEKA ANYAOKU, and even the issue of restructuring, which has been again very clearly articulated by our chairman for this occasion, and in a recent publication by Professor Adamaleko on decentralization, that power must truly return to the people and can only be done only if we de-emphasize the centrality of power and make the states much more viable, local governments much more viable, and have a bottom to top approaches. But also, in conclusion, I want to draw attention to a leadership recruitment process that foregrounds and rewards the visionary, the Pan-African, Pan-Nigerian patriotic, the public and the service-spirited, the self-respecting and dignified, and the self-effacing. There has to be a leadership recruitment process that is defined and supported as part of the elite consensus. Let me give another example. I was in Singapore as a visiting professor of one of their universities, and I happened to sit next to the chairman of the Singapore Public Service Commission. And I asked him, what are the major challenges we face as chairman of the Public Service Commission of Singapore? And I expected him, coming from Nigeria, that would talk about the challenges of recruitment, the challenge of promotion, discipline. He said, no, we've gone beyond that. So I said, then what do you do as chairman of the Public Service Commission? He said, we set a standard, meritocracy, and we pass that on to the sub-national groups, ministries, and departments and agencies of government. So what we do as a public service, listen to this. They say we go and identify talented students in secondary schools, and we train them, we recruit them, we mentor them, we send them to universities, because we are looking for the leaders of our business communities and government 25 years from now. But now there's a situation, as we know in our country, we don't know at all who our permanent secretaries will be, who our ministers will be, even years from now, because there is no process that defined to which we are all committed, which is based on meritocracy and based on appreciation of the challenges that will be faced even 25 years from now. Secondly, a conscious and concerted retooling of the state as a guarantee of security, unity, and the ideas of equal citizenship, with a particular focus on the civil service, social services, and the security services. And third, a new social bargain between the state and society on the free and equal employment of all rights by Nigerians, irrespective of their place of birth or place of residence. The scandalous underrepresentation of women in national politics and governance, including elected officials at all levels. I am scandalized that 36 states in Nigeria, not one has managed to elect a female as governor. Interestingly though, the two states that have come closest to electing female governors are in the north, Adamawa and Taraba states. It didn't happen, but nearly happened. Now yet, we think that, particularly in the southern part of Nigeria, high level of education, enlightenment and so on, that's where it should come from. And a nation that does not give parity or equality to the women to advance is shortchanging itself. And my own experience too, as head of the UN peacekeeping operation in Angola, and therefore, when there is problem, yes, who suffers the most? The women and the children. Now how come we ask them to put back together structures forming that broken, but we are not trusting them in the governance of our country? I believe this must change. Also, a much greater attention has to be given to constitutionalism in order to ensure that the operators of the constitution spread through the three arms of government and the three layers of our federal system, not only under the spirit of the constitution, but play by the rules of government embedded in it. These ideas that I've been talking about have been espoused in different forms and on different occasions, but no less our esteemed Chief ANYAOKU. Let me therefore end by commending him for his leadership and foresight, and by commitment to translate all these ideas into practice. And by the way, nobody is going to give us good governance. We have to demand it with the people that organize. All of us, young and old, men and women. And so I pray along with you that we may continue to benefit from Chief ANYAOKU's wisdom, his leadership for many years to come. Thank you for your kind attention.
Issues such as corruption, lack of transparency, economic instability, and social unrest have most times overshadowed our collective aspirations. As highlighted in a recent analysis, the failure of governance in Nigeria is evident in the declining capacity of political leaders to recognize systemic issues and implement necessary measures to address them. However, amidst these challenges lies an opportunity, a call to action for transformative leadership that is visionary, accountable, inclusive. Leadership that not only addresses immediate concerns, but also strategically positions Nigeria for future prosperity and safety. This transformational leadership will never happen under the present structure of which Nigeria is governed. I want to repeat that. This transitional leadership will never happen under the present structure on which Nigeria is governed. This is why I have long been advocating for the restructuring of Nigeria to become a proper federation, allowing state autonomy and bringing governance closer to its people. This also allows access to the mineral resources and natural resources for their development. I stand for respect for the rule of law, the need for a forthright and independent judiciary, a more effective and responsive military, police, and intelligence services. I also stand for the creation of state police, local policing for our communities. Above all, a school system that allows relevant human resources development that will propel Nigerians, our youth particularly, to be innovative and to face up to the challenges of the artificial intelligence world, AI. Not the least, Nigeria must have a truly people's federal constitution made by its ethnic nationalities and interest groups. The 1999 federal constitution restrains, I repeat, restrains development and harmonious coexistence of the Nigerian peoples. The imagined New World Economic Security and Development Order. It is imperative for immediate action to be taken for restructuring and providing a new People's Federal Constitution. We must not lose the opportunity to truly free ourselves from the constitutional bondage that we find ourselves in our country today. As I pondered the immense difficulties under which my younger colleagues in the military and security services operate, considering reports of inadequate manpower, weaponry, and the lack of the free hand to deal decisively with these bandits and insurgents marauding and occupying territories in our country, I received this post in my box, and I quote, what if Boko Haram won the war? In an alternate future, the unimaginable happens. The Nigerian military collapses. The final strongholds of Lagos, Abuja, and Port Harcourt fall, and the black flag of Boko Haram rises over the land. Nigeria is no longer a democracy. It's a caliphate. The constitution gone. The National Assembly banned. Western education banned nationwide. The girls are forbidden from going to school. Music, movies, and fashion all declared haram. Social media is shut down. Internet access controlled by the state. Books are banned. Laughter is silenced. Expression is crushed. Every Friday, stadiums filled not with cheering football fans, but with terrified citizens. They watch as criminals are executed, hands are chopped off, and unbelievers are publicly punished. This is the new Nigeria, a nation ruled by fear. Around the globe, embassies are shut down. The African Union expels Nigeria. The United Nations imposes sanctions. Nigeria becomes the North Korea of Africa, isolated, feared, and forgotten. But on the ground, something stirs. Deep in the forests of the South, in the hills of the Middle Belt, in the basements of across the East and other parts of Nigeria, resistance began to rise. Younger Nigerians formed secret networks, pirate radio stations, broadcast forbidden news. Old soldiers trained the next generation. A new slogan spread like wildfire. Take Nigeria. Hope still lives, but is flickering, dying slowly in the shadows of oppression. And now, only one question remains. How long until the green white green flag flies again? This is not a prediction, it's not prophecy, but it is a warning. Because when evil wins, it's not always with tanks, Sometimes it starts with silence, unquote. This scenario, to say the least, is worrying. But we can arrest it if we dare. Let me return to today's lecture, which I believe will serve as a platform for introspection, dialogue, and exchange of ideas on the ways to salvage our dear nation, Nigeria, from collapse. We expect that our respected lecturer, a colleague and friend with whom we redefined in our time the foreign policy direction of Nigeria, will delve into the multifaceted dimensions of leadership and governance, examining both historical context and the contemporary realities. We believe that this lecture will also emphasize our collective goal to unearth actionable insights and strategies that propel Nigeria towards a trajectory of excellence and equity. In conclusion, I encourage each participant to engage wholeheartedly, challenge prevailing narratives, and contribute to the evolving discourse. It is through our shared commitment and collaborative efforts that we can envisage and actualize a Nigeria where leadership is not a position of privilege, but a mandate of service. I repeat that. Actualizing Nigeria where leadership is not a position of privilege, but a mandate to serve. Finally, together we can chart a course towards a future where governance is truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. I thank you.